Hello, everyone. Welcome to Fired Up, the podcast for marketers working in early and late stage startups. I'm Morgan McClintock, the CEO of startup marketing agency Firebrand. We've launched this podcast to interview the best in the business, but I'm not going to do it alone. So please meet my co-hosts.
I'm Nicole Pytel, Firebrand's VP of Content Marketing.
And I'm Chris Ulbrich, Firebrand's Head of Media Relations.
I'm Ian Lipner, a tech PR and crisis communications veteran.
We'll drop a new episode each week, so there's plenty of fuel for your marketing fire. Get the spark you need to take your startup to a whole new level. Hello and welcome to Fired Up, the startup marketing podcast. My name's Morgan McClintock, and I'm joined today by my co-host, Chris Ulbrich.
Hello there, Morgan. I am very excited to be here today because we're going to be talking about some questions that have been on my mind for a while now. I'm going to feel like we're going to get some answers. And like questions like, how do you market a product when you're giving it away for free? When you don't even technically own it? How do you engage with a community that feels as invested in the product as you are? And what does success even look like? You know, those are the kinds of questions that open source software marketers grapple with every day. And luckily, we have one of the industry's leading practitioners here with us to offer advice.
Yes, we're joined today by Jonathan Symonds, who's the Chief Marketing Officer of MinIO, where he's responsible for product marketing, demand generation, and corporate awareness. Previously, Jonathan was the CMO at Ayasdi, a pioneer in the field of machine intelligence, and he was the VP of marketing at GPU-powered analytics provider HeavyAI, which is where we first met. Now, Jonathan has over 20 years in enterprise software and analytics marketing experience at Ace Metrix, Two-Wire, and Tandberg, and he holds an MBA from Cornell and a BA from Washington and Lee University. So, Jonathan, welcome to Fired Up.
Listen, thank you very much for having me on. I'm a big fan of the podcast, and I'm delighted to be here with you and Chris.
Well, thanks for your time. Now, I want to dive in with an initial question. I was just reading an article in Unite AI about the 5 best open source LLMs. And obviously, these companies, Llama 2, I think some people might, which is from Meta, some people might say, hey, that's not technically fully open source. But there's Llama 2, there's Bloom from Hugging Face, and there's a few that I was new to. MPT7B, which is from Mosaic ML Foundation. There's another one here called Falcon. And there's another one called Vicuna 13B, which is from the LMSys org. So basically, these companies are competing, open source companies, competing with some of the most highly funded businesses in the Valley right now, OpenAI, etc. And they have some advantages, they have some disadvantages. And I just wondered, from a marketing perspective, what's the difference between marketing a closed source proprietary product like a ChatGPT or OpenAI and one of these like Hugging Face is doing with Bloom?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a fairly complicated one because you do have sort of a range of openness even within the open source community, and you have kind of the Apache v2, which is the most liberal license, all the way through to some more constricted license, and then you have the freemium products that you can offer but really are proprietary in nature. I think at the heart of it, though, it's really how you position the value of it and how you talk about that product. And so when I talk about how you position the value of it, proprietary kind of requires more social proof, right? You're trying to convince more buyers than users, whereas in the open source community, you're really trying to basically make a land grab and to roll up developers. And so that requires a different conversation that's less around social proof, but it's really around the value that you get with it. There's a philosophical component to it. So that all comes through content creation. Now, in both those worlds, you're going to have content creation. I would say that in the open source world, you're going to have to put your foot on the pedal much more so on the content creation part of it, because you're seeking to educate first and foremost. And I think the other piece is that, just from an overall message perspective, the product is the message. in open source. And because there's no friction between the user and the product, that product has to be great, and everything around that product has to be great. So that's the documentation, right? That's the clarity of the license. It's all of those different things. So it really is a fundamentally different approach. It's mission driven as opposed to really kind of corporate driven in terms of how you approach it.
On that note, that raises a really, I think is a fundamental question about the role of a startup in an open source product and alongside an open source community. I think if there's one thing people know who aren't maybe in the industry about open source technology, it's that open source is developed in a sort of communal, collaborative way. And we all know from, on this podcast here, we all know that there are different degrees of involvement from communities, and some projects are highly community driven and so on. But if you could speak generally, what is the role of a startup in an open source project dedicated to creating an open source product that the startup doesn't even technically own?
So let me speak to that, and then I want to speak a little bit to the fact of the fact that MinIO does own its own piece, because I think they are slightly different. But very often the case is that the project is open source and it may be owned by the CNCF or Apache Foundation, and then a company gets built around that, and they are primarily offering support and they're offering additional features that may be above and beyond that, and they'll still be a major contributor to that project. In that world, you think of them in the context of, they're some of the best players on that team, but there's a team. There may be multiple people supporting that. There may be the core project in which they are primary contributors. Think of them as a leader in that space, a Databricks or a Confluent or somebody like that, who's really built around something that's truly open source. Starburst is another example of that. What the world is looking for from them is they're looking for leadership. And they're looking for leadership in terms of technology. They're looking for leadership in terms of, for the most part, enterprise features, because even though they are built around an open source project and open source themselves, they are commercializing that open source project. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. We have plenty of colleagues who work in that space and are, incredible stewards in the open source world. So I think leadership is the key thing that people look for out of those companies. Then there are other companies like ours, which is, a single vendor commercial open source company where we own MinIO, we own the copyright to MinIO, we're the primary contributor to MinIO. We have thousands of other contributors, but we tightly control that. That's a little bit more of a benevolent dictatorship. That's kind of how we think about it. But in that case, the community is looking to us for stewardship. Are we doing the right things? Are we being transparent about what we're doing and why we're doing it? And so they're two slightly different things that the community looks for in those different models. And, I think that you can be very successful with both of those models, and you can be very true to the underlying ethos of open source with both of those models.
That's fascinating. Could you break down for us how a startup demonstrates leadership on the one side and stewardship on the other? What are some concrete examples of how a startup would do that?
Leadership on the one side would fall to doing things that may not be generally applicable, but for a certain subset of enterprise customers are almost requirements. And so building that feature set into the product, even though it may not be available, and parts of it may be available in the open source, but other parts may be held back because, again, these are commercial entities by nature, and the investors are looking to achieve a return on that. So I think those are examples where you'll find, and it could be security, it could be identity and access management features, things that may not play for the broader community, but are incredibly important to those folks. In terms of stewardship, MinIO has the ability to close source MinIO, but we wouldn't ever do that. It's philosophical for us, right? It's part of how we approach this. And actually open source really is much a marketing strategy as anything else, right? It allows us to get the broadest possible adoption to impose the least amount of friction between us and users. And that's why MinIO has been so successful. I mean, as of last look this morning, we're close to 1.5 billion Docker pulls. We're not Instagram, we're storage software. When you put that number in context, it's pretty amazing. Stewardship means doing the right thing from a license perspective. It means doing the right thing from a community support perspective. We had 28,000 people who are on our Slack channel, and we still give out free support each and every day. Our engineers are over there looking to help people out, not with the how do I get MinIO started questions, but the ones that are even next level up that other people would say, oh, we wouldn't do that because that's going to get it between us and revenue. We do that because it's the right thing to do, because we're trying to grow the MinIO way. That's what I mean by stewardship.
And you raise an interesting point when you mentioned the word philosophy there. And of course, you described, or you mentioned that in some respects, you could describe open source as a marketing strategy. But of course, for the end user, it's typically, well, for many end users, it's a philosophy, it's an ideal. So how do you, in practice, day to day, sort of balance the expectations of, the more idealistic users with the commercial demands of running a business? Like, to what extent are those two ever in conflict?
It's a very fair question. And there is conflict that arises from time to time. I think that the key is that, we always fall back on kind of what are the principles of the brand. And that is goodness, it's simplicity and minimalism in terms of what it is that we have and what we're giving to the market. It's craftsmanship in the product. And so we're going to default to that in most cases. And we haven't found a case where we have not been able to resolve this. You can balance that with what it is that you need from an enterprise perspective and from a revenue perspective, because fundamentally they do go hand in hand. Something that is remarkably simple to deploy scales economically. And when it scales economically, guess what? That has attraction, that attracts enterprise customers because they can, do more with less, less hardware, less people, less everything. We've always been able to find that balance. I suspect there's some use case out there where we could not, but to date, we have not had any problem both growing the community and growing the top line revenue number.
So if open source in many ways is a bit of a marketing approach, who are we marketing to? Are we marketing to the community of developers? Are we marketing to those outside, to the enterprise? And I think sort of related, if this is a sort of a marketing approach, you could do it more simply with a PLG kind of play where you don't have to build that community. So who are we marketing to when we're marketing an open source product?
You bring up PLG, and we very much think of our motion to date as being PLG driven, right?
Okay.
We talked about the product is really that is the core message for us and everything that goes around it. But, in terms of who you talk to, it really depends on kind of what phase you are in your journey. And I think that this is something that's important for all open source marketers to understand, is that as you grow, your needs, requirements, and focus is going to change, right? It is not going to be unilateral. We're just in this for the community for all time. But when we started, we were about as community focused as we could possibly be. And that comes through what we're marketing to them with is really content. So teaching them the MinIO way of thinking about the cloud operating model, ensuring that they understand that it's not a place, that it's a set of principles. It's showing them how MinIO interacts with the other tools that they're using in their toolkit, right? So MinIO and Snowflake or MinIO and SQL Server, even those are proprietary products, they speak and interact perfectly well with open source products like MinIO. So I think those component parts are what you're doing really coming out of the gate. Now, over time, and we think of this in terms of the transition between users to buyers, you will tilt your messaging to start to mix in more thought leadership. And the reason you're going to be able to do that is because now you've assembled a collection of customers that are using your product in unique and value attributable ways. And so now you start to tell those stories, and those stories are a little bit more targeted toward the buyer persona than necessarily the user persona. And if you've done it right, what works out is that you have champions from the user base for when that buyer comes down and says, what do we know about MinIO? And they say, well, funny you should mention that. We run so-and-so systems on MinIO already today. And so those two things can come together in a powerful way.
Right. And I think one of the problems there, though you just touched on, is often in an open source environment, you don't know who the users are, or maybe you know this organization is using it, but you don't know how, you don't know who. And at some point, you want to engage with them and get that story out when you're having your sort of enterprise motion. How do you identify those people? What's the best way to get them to stick their hand up and say, actually, I'm using it and in this way?
It's very important from a marketing perspective that you always be thinking about what is the commercial element of this, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that you're going to over-rotate in that direction because as AB, who's our CEO, likes to say, no one wants to kill the golden egg-laying goose because that's how you grow. Yeah. And so you have to, it's a very careful balance there. Having said that, you should always be thinking about what are the tools and technologies that I can put in place that allow me to have an appropriate but very powerful listening system.
Right.
And so when I say that, I'm not going to go into the tools necessarily that we use, but we use multiple tools that give us signal. And sometimes that signal is different than the other signal, but we actually consider that to be valuable as opposed to unvaluable. Certain people in the research say, well, if I have two signals that disagree, that's bad. We don't see it that way. We actually see it as something that we can learn more from. So we have multiple systems that we use that allows us to try to de-anonymize users, the intensity of that use. And when I say users, I'm talking about at the corporate level. We don't have any capacity to kind of dial into what the exact person is. But over time, guess what? You can figure out that the cloud architect or the DevOps engineer is generally who you're going to want to be targeting that persona. So we've developed those very sophisticated listening systems. I would say here that it's very important. And again, we talk about stewardship and we talk about leadership. Very important that you're comfortable that you would be able to defend your choices if asked to on Twitter or on LinkedIn, because you shouldn't be doing anything that you wouldn't be able to say, well, this is how we did it. And it's standard web analytics practices and this, that, and the other. So we always ask ourselves, would we be comfortable if somebody said, well, golly, it seems like you figured this out? And you have to always be asking yourself because again, particularly when we talk about stewardship, trust arrives on foot and it leaves on a horseback. I mean, these are key components that you have to really maintain that. And the bigger you get, the higher the standard gets because the higher the stakes become.
Right. So in this instance, hey, look, we can see through, I don't know, a lead land, a lead feed, like a reverse IP lookup that your organization is coming to our website to do something and you're the cloud architect. I'm not saying you use this tool, or Common Room on GitHub or whatever. Those are commonly used. They're widely used tools. Everyone knows it. You would not be, people might not want it to be that overt, but, it's standard practice.
Exactly. If you're consuming 600 pages of documentation a month,
right.
That's a signal. And we should be converting that signal into, ABM, right, in order to then educate you on the commercial aspects of a license and the benefits of that with MinIO. So again, because we're open source, doesn't mean that we don't think about commercial ends, because we do.
Right. And I see other tactics like, hey, we're going to do an awards for the best implementation of our tool, and people will then nominate themselves, and it's a great way to get them to come up on stage at your conference, or, hey, take in your details and get this T-shirt because you're a big advocate of our brand, and you can attract a certain hand raisers there by doing those kinds of tactics.
You bring up a very good point because, listen, we have distributed tens of thousands of T-shirts.
Right.
People are aligned with your brand if you're doing it correctly. They want to be part of that thing that you are building. So listen, we won Gartner's Peer Insights last year, Customer Choice Award. We've got a big head start for this year. And we do that because we have people who want to stand up and tell our story, but they also want to get a t-shirt in return, right? It's a nominal amount, but they want to be part of that brand.
On that note, it sounds as though paid media is not off limits for this kind of campaign. One might assume that there would be some sort of taint attached to, in an open source context, to paying for promotion. But it sounds like in a lot of cases, one can have a more practical, pragmatic relationship with your community, and they're not necessarily going to be allergic to every form of paid promotion.
Yes. From our perspective, it's about matching your paid engagement with your audience. And so you have to be authentic in order to be successful, particularly with developers and in particular DevOps types who are effectively allergic to anything they perceive as true marketing. But there are channels out there for which they go to, advance their careers, to become smarter, to learn, and things like the New Stack with whom we have a relationship. That audience is our audience. And I tell Alex that all the time. And that's why we continue to have a relationship and why our content continues to do very well over there. But there's also things like Hacker Noon. There's Deb2. We syndicate content on Hacker Noon because ultimately we see really good performance out of that. And again, most of the content we write is not MinIO centric. It's really MinIO with or best practices around things like that. And so it does well over there. So you can do both, but I think you have to be very attuned to who your audience is.
So that raises an interesting question. From the community's point of view, do you think it matters not just whether it's paid or not paid promotion, but to whom the payment is going? Is it important that you be seen as spending your marketing dollars supporting the community?
I don't think so. And I can only speak for MinIO, which again owns the end-to-end piece of this. But I don't think it does. I think what's more important is the quality of the content that you're putting out there. And again, whether it's paid or unpaid, truth of the matter is the way the journalism world works today, those lines are blurrier and blurrier. And for the right conversation or the right amount of money, it can look like they wrote it. That's just the nature of where we are in journalism. But I think the quality of the content, the non-promotional nature of that content matters. And I will say that developers know. And so, there are certain places that they really do draw the line very, very strongly on non-promotional content. And I think that developers know that. And over time, they gravitate toward those types of publications.
While we're on the topic of content, as practitioners, we are down in the trenches actually making the content that appears on, all these channels, but we're not necessarily the technical experts that could create that content from out of nothing. There needs to be engagement with engineers and evangelists and so on. So from a practical point of view, given that so much of this content is technical and there's a desire to produce it at scale, but there's also the challenge of producing it at scale, how do you sort of balance all those considerations and come up with the most efficient process for making content that doesn't come directly from engineers?
Ultimately, this is a role that we learned early on requires accountability and responsibility. And so we went out and we hired 5 just subject matter experts in their area to just write content. And they have a quota about what I expect out of them every week in terms of the amount of content that I expect them to produce. There's wiggle room in there. If somebody's doing some massive piece, they're doing the defining piece on Iceberg and MinIO, that might take 2 weeks. So I have subject matter experts in DevOps. I have subject matter experts in databases and data lakes. I have a subject matter expert in AI and ML. And their job is to write technical content. They all can code, and that's a requirement to come work in the bullpen writers here. But we have a MinIO expert as well. That's an expectation of them. Now, when that happens and engineers see that content, it actually increases their confidence that they can create content as well. And they know that they have a partner who will be able to work through that piece with them to produce more content. And so you actually get this very interesting side benefit of more engineers are willing to write if you have great technical writers in your team, because they don't feel like this person's going to water it down in some way, in fashion or manner that would dilute it to the point where they don't feel proud about it. They're going to actually up-level it in a lot of ways. So those two things work hand in hand. It's something that we have invested disproportionately in, and we have benefited accordingly.
I can just hear a lot of our listeners out there. Their thoughts are so loud. I can sense them through the ether. They're thinking, I can't even find someone to write non-technical content. And you've hired 5 expert technical writers who have the sort of the background and technical know-how to generate this kind of content from scratch. Like, where are these people? Who are these people? Where do you find them?
So they are hard to find. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. You will get a lot of people who would think they're technical or have spent a lot of time in very large organizations with technical titles, but have sort of lost the skill set that you really need to work at somewhere like MinIO. One, you have to screen for intellectual curiosity. Very often, the people we hire are actually self-taught. And so that's a huge plus from our perspective, because we know that they can really push through adversity in terms of learning curves. And that's an important part. And then the third part is they have to want to write. They have to want to create content. I think those things are, again, very hard to find. But, I have AB and Garima as part of that interview track for every one of those people that we hire into those roles, because my assessment is not going to be enough. AB's got to be able to really scratch against the grain and figure out if there's something really hard there, from a technology background.
So just to be clear, AB is your CEO, is on the interview track to review the quality of the people that you bring in full time as a content creator at MinIO.
Yes. Yeah.
That's the level and the importance that the company places. And you're talking about writing. And is it always writing, or are these YouTube videos that I know a lot of developers consume, or are they podcast created? Like, are we only talking blog posts and docs, written docs, or are we talking multiple formats? And if so, what's working?
We produce content across every bucket that we think a learner will need in order to advance their journey of knowledge of MinIO. We have a whole team dedicated to YouTube. We've produced 400 plus videos this year. We've got, I think, 5 people on that team, and that includes 3 animated shorts that are worthy of Academy Awards. They're just remarkable learning videos. Those take a long time because they are truly works of art. YouTube is a great source for us, and we're doing, I think, 60 to 70,000 views a week in terms of those channels, right? We also go out of our way to promote anybody else who's creating content for us, because, again, MinIO is open source. We have this huge cult following among developers. And so we see something in Portuguese, we're putting it out on social. We're putting it into our newsletter. We see something in German. We're making sure that we're promoting that as well. Written content, video content. Podcast is an area where we have yet to sort of crack nut on. We think it's important for us, but we haven't quite a way to figure out how to do it in the MinIO way yet. We're going to get there this year.
Wow. So just so I'm clear on this, on the scale of the content creation at MinIO, there's 5 writers, and it occurs to me maybe you can recruit those from the community as a good, because they're already subject matter. But is there a separate team of these 5 other people who are doing these videos? So this is a mini content agency in many ways that you're creating within the company. Is Do I have that right?
Yeah, it's a little like Florentine Studios over here. There's a YouTube team, there's a writing team.
Yeah, that's a big investment.
It is. I would also say that it's an investment that we didn't add the YouTube team until really in the last year and a half. But we had a content team prior to that, cranking out core stuff. And then again, documentation in the open source world can never be underestimated. It is your primary language and contact point with your community.
So I wanted to quickly just talk about measurement and, and all the way down into the sales cycle if we can. Like the base level product is free. From a marketing perspective, what are the KPIs that you are tracking? Is it downloads? Is it the commits and stars? Or is it's clearly the engagement with the content. I mean, you just off the top of your head here, 60,000 was it views on YouTube. So you've got that very top of funnel stuff. How are you measuring performance?
So we look at it in different buckets. So we'll look at it certainly from a web and a digital perspective. So we look at total views, but we look at pricing page views, erasure code calculator views, reference hardware views, because those are production indicators, right? So if people are spending a bunch of time on that, we know that they're moving toward the door and we want to be there to open it for them. That's a key area. Engagement time on page, bounce rate, all those things. We measure every single thing of those for those core parts of it. We also measure, and these are not necessarily revenue directional, but they're important to the health of the overall brand, which is how's the Slack channel growing? What do our Docker polls look like? We're doing about 1.1 million a day at this point. So we feel that's a very healthy number for us, and we want that number to continue to grow. But at some point, we get so big, it gets a little harder to grow past that. We also look at social growth. Obviously, the rise and fall of X has made that a little blurry, but certainly from a LinkedIn perspective, we are totally dialed into that. We also measure content production. We look at the blogs, who's reading what types of blogs. Are certain blogs doing better in re-syndication or on Hacker News and so forth, and measuring all of those things. Then we look at PR, share of voice, those types of things. Those things are important to us. And then, we also look at product metrics. So, when I just talked about kind of what the Docker polls are on a daily basis, but, that's an area that we measure. So we look at pretty much everything. We are about as metrics driven as you get. In terms of your question around the sales funnel, we do view it in a kind of a traditional lens. Yeah. We have a kind of a whole buyer's journey that we've established here. So, stage one are people who are, picking up content on the website, reading the blogs. Stage two, we'll start to say, maybe some MinIO downloads, but maybe not persistent. Stage three, we're going to see persistent MinIO downloads, potentially multiple geographies. Stage four, you're going to see they're consuming tremendous amount of content. They're on the pricing page. They may be on the compliance page. They're on the reference calculator. We're seeing multiple geographies of deployment, metrics and all those things. And so that's kind of the journey that we're trying to push them through. And we're looking at the stage three people and being like, can we feed them content to get them into that stage four group? And then the stage four group, we're feeding them maybe on content because we want them in stage five, because stage five means they're customers. We are trying to move them along. And again, we're 100% inbound at MinIO at this point. It is just who's ringing the doorbell this week. We may modify that as we go forward and we try to get to that next kind of level for our organization. But to date, we've done it really just through this content engine.
That's very impressive. Another part of this, I think, is sort of where you fit within the partner ecosystem. Partner marketing is really important, showing up with the right partners, helping the community understand where you fit and what the capabilities are. Can you just talk to us a bit about that? Do you have someone dedicated to it? What's your philosophy when it comes to partner marketing?
This is a recent add in our organization, is to have somebody who's primarily accountable and responsible for this. She's a very seasoned executive. She's hit the ground running in a way that is meaningful for us. Partners are important. We have a tendency to think about them here in terms of buckets. So we have ecosystem partners, That could include someone like a Snowflake or a SQL Server. A Starburst would be somebody in that ecosystem partner. We think about it in terms of hardware partners, right? So we run on commodity software. But Supermicro, Dell, HP, those are all partners for us. We think of them in terms of kind of deployment partners. So we are in the marketplace at AWS and GCP and Azure, but we also have a very strong relationship with Equinix, from a colo perspective. Then you have the kind of more traditional resellers and SI partners, which are also very important to us, like a Parasoft in government, someone like a TD Synnex or a WWT. Those are important go-to-market partners for MinIO that we are in the process of developing now in this model. So that's actually very important for any startup in the open source space that has a limited SLG, so sales-led growth motion, right, because it allows you to tap a much bigger and experienced and sophisticated ecosystem of sellers. And you can get that. Again, TD Synnex is a giant global organization. If you can get onto their line card and build that relationship, it can be very, very beneficial to you. I do think that, and listen, I think everybody's board of an open source company will tell them this as well, is that yes, the Accentures and the Deloittes are very attractive from a logo perspective, but that's a hard, long road to go. And, you got to balance your investment there with, what your shorter term requirements are.
Again, speaking generally, because there are so many kinds of partners, when you're talking about getting on their dance card, what are partners looking for from the startup? We often look at it from the startup's perspective, but what can a startup do to make itself more attractive to partners?
Part of it falls into this concept of where is the commercialization aspect of it? They're in it for money. And they may have built huge businesses. And if you go look at some of these companies, they built a huge business in partnership with OpenShift from Red Hat or other products in that Red Hat lineup. And so there's absolutely an answer there. They're looking for, what is the lift from a commercialization perspective? So can my salespeople move this product? They're looking for how differentiated, that story is, that technology is, that product is from their perspective, because they have a full line card and they're not looking to have duplicates or triplicates in any one area. They're looking for things that stand out, that they can fill certain niches when they go in and have that conversation and be like, I actually have the exact right tool for you, as opposed to you don't need to use a hammer just because everything looks like a nail kind of concept. So I think those two things are important, being differentiated and then being a light lift. I think the other thing that they look for is they do look for maturity on the management team side to understand that channel, right? So familiarity with that channel, because they have expectations around margin and they have expectations around, how this thing goes. It's not transactional. You're building a relationship that should be long-term in nature, because the friction for them to adopt you and then drop you is considerable. And that looks bad on the person who brought you in. So they are thinking about this from a long-term perspective.
And what are some of the specific questions that they might ask you? Like if you were to get in a room with a potential partner and they're sort of investigating some of the topics that you've just outlined there, what are some, I think you've touched on some of them, but like what are maybe the top 5 questions you should be prepared to answer in that kind of meeting?
Where you fit, I think is a big piece of it. What specific differentiated component pieces you bring to the table from a competitive standpoint. We do this better than anybody else in the space. It could be performance, it could be scalability, it could be security, whatever it may be across that spectrum. I think those are 2 things you have to be able to answer. Third is you need to come to the table with a plan. Like, this is what I'm willing to share with you, from a revenue perspective. I think that is a key piece. And I think the fourth piece would be really around how are you going to support me in this endeavor? Because I'm not just going out and repping your product. How are you going to help me with that? What are your resources to do that? And that again comes back to content. it's a fairly easy conversation when somebody comes in and says, well, how are you on Kubernetes? And I can go onto our blog and I can type in Kubernetes and there's 35 blog posts that speak to that. And then I can go over to documentation and I can type in Kubernetes and there's, 6 pieces of content that speak to that. That shows them maturity. And that's kind of one of the things that they look for.
I think earlier I was asking about contributions to the community and the importance or lack of importance of being seen as putting your money toward organizations that were invested in the community that you're involved with. The one area where that is sort of most explicit would be events. And I just wonder, if we just set aside all the other forms of promotion and just look at events, how important is that in the marketing mix today, post-pandemic? And what role, if any, do you see events playing in an open source's marketing mix, like a startup's marketing mix?
In the post-pandemic world, people actually want to go to events again. We were blown away by what happened to us in Valencia 2 years ago at KubeCon. People were they were so excited to be there around their colleagues and in that environment. For an open source company, because of your limited visibility, assuming that you're following kind of appropriate rules, because of your limited visibility into what it is that your customers are doing, it is an incredible place for them to come out of the woodwork and tell you what they're doing. And so one of the great things that we love about KubeCon is that people come up and they want the t-shirt, but they also want to tell us what they're doing with that. And they may not be a commercial customer today, but they may outline something where we can say, you know what, you would benefit hugely from a commercial license for these reasons. And so it starts that conversation. It puts a name with a face and allows us to have that, put them onto our newsletter, to start to nurture them in ways that, again, we know they're a user and we know they're a brand ambassador for us. So that's one of the huge, powerful elements of basically working with that environment.
What about your own events? Do you have at MinIO, have you got up to having your own user conference with you? I talked about awards and sort of, really building that platform. I see that as a common approach in open source. How do you think about that?
Yeah, we're looking at that pretty hard. We've reached the scale where it makes sense. It's also very resource intensive. So I think we're going to start this year by doing some road shows, some one-day type of things, going to places where, again, using our analytics, we know that we have, a critical mass of people who are using MinIO and setting up shop for a day in that city and having 2 tracks, one for developers, one for architects, half day, maybe full day, meet in the middle with lunch that's got a keynote from one of the executives. So I think we're going to start there. They can be incredibly powerful, but they also become all-consuming. Ask the folks at reInvent. They take like 2 weeks off and then they're back playing again. And, it's pretty amazing.
Events are definitely something that you can kind of scale up and test the waters there and say, hey, we're going to do this small event in New York or what have you, and then grow it. But once you start, yes, you're on the treadmill, but a great way for open source companies to kind of get the people, the community together. We're about to move on to our next section, but before we do, I just wondered whether you had any sort of final thoughts or advice for startups in the open source space.
From a marketing perspective, and I'm speaking from my seat, I think it is important to recognize that open source is as much of a marketing play. It's not a business model. Open source is a way to reduce friction between you and your end user. And yes, there are reasons that you do it that have to do with freedom from lock-in, freedom to inspect. These are philosophical principles that are important. But at the end of the day, you cannot sustain an open source project forever without any revenue. And so you have to be thinking about that. And it's the responsible thing to do because ultimately you're doing this because it's important to the development community and the development community wants you to be around. When you talk about stewardship, it's about making sure that there's an economic model that's sustainable behind this project. Otherwise, you end up like the 18 million, GitHub repositories that weren't able to make it go. And so I think that, there is a responsibility that comes with being open source as well.
I like that because we often think about open source in in this very community oriented perspective, but there is a commercial imperative to it too. And I'm hearing that sort of come through, and there's a good reason for making that sustainable so that the project can continue. Our next section is called Smart People, Dumb Questions. And these are personal questions in which I just pull questions out of a bag here on my desk. So if you're ready, we'll just change gears a little bit. The first question here is, what book has changed your life and that you most recommend?
Well, book that changed my life. Let's talk about a business book that that impacted me greatly. So listen, I really like the Blue Ocean Strategy.
Yeah.
Came out of an HBR article about maybe 2 decades ago, I think at this point. But it really speaks to something that I think all open source and startups should be thinking about, is that where can you find the uncontested space in which you can grow? And then, it's got elements of the innovator's dilemma in there as well. Let you grow and in that uncontested space, and then you can start to move into more contested space. And that's exactly what MinIO did. Right. So MinIO built the high performance Kubernetes native object store at first, and nobody was paying attention to that market. They were all battling for, price per gig and, for backup workloads. Meanwhile, MinIO was picking up all these advanced analytic workloads. And all of a sudden, the giants turned around and MinIO was as big as them, if not bigger, when you take in terms of global penetration. And so I love that book.
Oh, I like that. What's one thing that's on your bucket list for this year?
From our perspective, we want to be consumers of AI, but we really want to establish, MinIO as basically the core of what is the AI data infrastructure. And that's going to be it's a big lift, but I think we're well positioned for it. And so I think that's from a professional perspective, that's really what's on our list.
On a personal note, have you ever been mistaken for a celebrity?
I have not.
Fair enough. If you could have one skill that you could learn instantly, what would it be?
I think empathy.
Mm-hmm. You don't have that at the moment.
Listen, I think that if you're in marketing, you just always working on it. Yeah. And as a marketer, as your audience has changed, as your company grows, that capacity to understand the other side and how they want to consume things it's a constant journey. But listen, that's taken me most of my career to get good at that, but I'm not expert. And if I could snap my fingers and learn that when I was a 22-year-old, it'd be a different story.
I think that's definitely important from a marketing perspective. So I like that. And what's the strangest job you've ever done?
So strangest job, when I was in my 20s, I worked for the State Department for Secretary Baker, and I worked in legislative affairs. And so every once in a while, because I was the one single guy who worked in the office, they'd say, so-and-so senator is staying late this weekend and they want to review some type of documentation. And so basically the PM would go into the safe and assemble all the top secret documents. And then I would go to the Capitol and I would sit there and do crossword puzzles for about 3 hours while John Kerry was reviewing POW and MIA documents, or somebody else was reviewing the Burmese drug triangle trade or whatever it may have been. And I would sit up there, and then at 11 o'clock at night, they'd want to go home, and I'd get back in the car and go lock up the safe and hopefully not set off the alarm, and then go home, more likely to a bar at that point in my life. But that was an odd job, to say the least.
Transporting top secret documents for people in power. I love that. Our next section is called FiredUp 5, which is our quickfire round. So I'm going to hand it over to Chris.
All right. Rapid fire. Are you ready?
I'm ready.
Okay, here we go. What would you be doing if you weren't in marketing?
I would be a fly fishing guide.
Oh, outdoorsy. All right. What is the best career advice you were ever given?
Be curious. I think intellectual curiosity just goes so far, and you'll never suffer if you're willing to learn.
What tool have you recently started using others might not know about?
I think ChatGPT is obviously not going to qualify as a good answer here. We're actually, I think some people know about this, but we're huge fans of Winter. which allows you to evaluate your messaging. This is People at Jar, a startup. And if you're not using it, you absolutely have to look at it. It's remarkable.
All right. We'll check that out. What hot trend have you got your eye on that is not ChatGPT, generative AI?
The trend that we're looking at, I mean, it's so much of our business is built around this, but kind of the modern data lake and the evolution of the modern data lake is a huge piece. And so that includes open table formats, but it's how you're going to build large scale data infrastructure going forward. And of course, it relates to AI, but it is that modern data lake concept that we're pretty attached to.
Okay. And then finally, now you gave us your big professional goal for 2024 earlier about AI infrastructure. What's your biggest personal goal for 2024?
We've opened a Singapore office and we're doing a number of events over there this year. And there's one with I think 2 weeks in between it. And I'm going to try to get to New Zealand to go fly fishing.
Oh, there we go. We're bringing it right back to fly fishing. Okay.
Don't tell my wife. I haven't told her yet.
Your secret is safe with us until this goes live.
Jonathan Symonds, the Chief Marketing Officer at MinIO. Thanks for joining us on FiredUp. Now, if people want to get in touch with you, where should they go?
Connect with me on LinkedIn. Reference this show. I get a lot of folks on LinkedIn because you're the CMO and people want to sell you things. But reference this, and I'm happy to engage.
Great. Really enjoyed talking with you today, Jonathan. Thanks so much for your time, and we look forward to talking with you again soon. Well, that about wraps it up for today. But before we close, we did want to offer all of our Fired Up friends a chance to grab a mega pack of all of our ebooks and guides. That's our guide to content marketing. That's our startup guide to paid media using Google Ads. It's our guide to attribution. You can get all of those, over 100 pages of goodness, at firebrand.marketing/firedup freebies. That's freebies with an S. And we hope you enjoyed the show. And if you did, please give us a rating wherever you get your podcasts or drop us a note at firebrand.marketing. And as ever, the details of how to get in touch with our guest today can be found in the show notes. Thank you for listening. And until next week, get out there and crush your marketing goals.